Good evening and welcome to 600 Seconds. Tonight we'll be introducing a very particular guest to say the least. His identity is no doubt public, however, little is known about the relationship he had with the man that inspired him. Of course, many of us do not necessarily make public the mentors in our life. Tonight, our guest, Steve Johnson, has felt compelled to share with us not only who his mentor is, but also the priceless knowledge that he shared. And welcome to this presentation of 600 Seconds. As always, my name is John Beckman, and we welcome all of you to the show tonight. We have a very special guest this evening who is here to shed some light on his father's radical views. Please welcome Steve Johnson, son of the late author Ray Anderson. Thank you for joining us, Steve.
It's my pleasure, John. Big fan of your show.
Well, thank you, Steve. As most of our viewers know, you are here to clarify some of the ideas that your late father held. But before we get into that, perhaps you could enlighten us on the nature of your relationship you held with Ray.
I'll be honest with you, John. Our relationship had its ups and downs. As you know, my mother and Ray were not married, so naturally that creates a different dynamic compared to the ones that he had with his natural children. Nevertheless, he always was a kind-hearted man and provided me with a top-notch education. I can honestly say I wouldn't be where I am today without him.
That's very touching. Now, Ray had many reasons to be proud of you other than just being his son. Would I be correct in saying that you followed in his footsteps in a sense?
Yes, John, you're correct in saying that. Although I'd have to say that following in his footsteps is putting it a little mildly. I'd like to say that I took the ideas that Ray integrated into Interface and applied, maybe even expanded upon, who knows, to my own company, GravTech.
For listeners who aren't privy on the inner workings of GravTech and Interface, could you briefly explain what these companies do? Not in detail maybe, just a brief framework.
Well, John, Interface, which my father was both the chairman and founder of, is and was one of the leading producers of modular carpeting both at the commercial and residential level. GravTech, my baby, is a large producer in the United States of environmentally friendly light bulbs. Both of these companies have been heralded for their stances on sustainability and industrial ecology.
I see. So these are two large companies, am I right? No wonder the people are impressed that you have been able to commit so wholeheartedly to the environmental cause. How did this come about?
My father laid the blueprint, John. GravTech's sustainability efforts mirror those that Ray instituted years ago across Interface.
Yes, your father did a lot of interesting ideas, to say the least. There are a few that I think we have chosen to discuss for the purpose of the interview. Before we look at anything specific, could you give us the overall purpose of these efforts?
In a phrase, long-term sustainability. Our companies want to defy the stereotype that green efforts and profit must be at odds, which is an opinion held across corporate America even today.
How so?
Okay, let's use a classic example that my dad always used to use. The amount of money and dependence that we use and have in connection with the oil industry is getting completely out of hand. As many Americans know, fossil fuels, at the rate of consumption that we use today, will eventually be all used up. But what they don't realize, and what actually is more important to men like you and me, is that it's even more important from a business standpoint. It's how cost ineffective our dependence on oil has become.
You don't say.
It's true, John. Oil prices have skyrocketed, and yet we continue to consume them at astronomical rates. Did you know, I'm serious here, John, that the amount of energy it takes to move a ton of freight by light rail is less than 1/10 the cost to move that same ton by truck? And yet we still primarily use trucks. My father's company, Interface, moved over 80% of their North American product by over-the-road trucking in 2007. Not only were they leaving a large carbon footprint, but being cost ineffective at the same time. Interface's European factories, which have access to light rail, which have access to light rails, cut transportation costs by 25% merely by switching from trucking to rail. The savings will only increase as the price of oil continues to rise. And here's the crazy thing, John. Look at my eyes. Look at my eyes right now. The U.S. continues to build roads instead of light rails.
That does seem like a practical thing to do. But how does one go about doing this? It seems like an unattainable task.
My father outlined this process in his Quest initiative. First, a company must quantify the problem, one continent at a time. So for instance, identify the problem of excess fuel being used company-wide. The next step is to identify areas for growth across the whole world.
Areas for growth? Do you mean developing new technologies?
No, not necessarily. This more means taking a look internally to find areas that increase environmental sustainability.
What are some areas that you and your father have addressed within your respective companies?
Well, John, I'm going to use an overall example of looking inward. It would be to cut carbon emissions every year in a quantifiable way. But if you're looking for a specific example, it would be UPS's idea of EPA Smart Way Transport. Have you ever heard of this? Okay. This program looks to understand what kind of carbon output the company is making in transportation. This basically means selecting the most carbon and cost-efficient means of transportation that are possible in every kind of different situation.
So, what did the system actually accomplish?
We know how earlier I said that trucking was an ineffective means of transportation? Well, since the U.S. does not have a light rail system, which I don't know why, that can cross the country, there are other ways to save money and decrease the carbon footprint at the same time.
Such as?
The UPS SmartWay system found a couple of ways to decrease carbon emissions while still using possible ways of transportation that exist in the United States. For example, a company can cut 10% of their transportation costs by using single-wide tires for efficiency. Also, 10% of energy costs can be cut by using a hybrid chilling system that runs off of ground power.
Wow, I never would think that the two would correlate.
You know, John, it makes sense if you really think about it. At some point down the road, companies will not be able to run completely off of fossil fuels. But oil dependence is a problem that we no longer need to have. We can create a vibrant economy and lasting security if we embrace the fact that cost saving and sustainability go hand in hand.
So Steve, you touched on several strategies that you currently are employing in your current businesses. For those businesses just starting out who want to, go green and improve sustainability, what would you suggest their first steps should be?
Well, John, like I touched on briefly before, you got to take a look inward, and really you got to take a look at your supply chain and start at the beginning, start with your manufacturing, and look and see which ways can be improved. What can you do about your manufacturing that will make your company more sustainable?
So you've discussed, UPS and your own company, GrafTech, as being sustainable or moving to be more sustainable. What would you say to those companies that that's not their top priority?
Well, it's a common assumption throughout corporate America today that, like I said, this isn't financially viable. And what I would just say to them out there in America is that it is. It's worked. It's proven. Many companies now, lots of companies now, are doing this, and there's no reason that everyone can't. And it'd really be a shame if not everyone gets on board with this.
Well, thank you, Steve. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have in our program today. See you next week when we host Oprah Winfrey to talk about her opinions about this upcoming election.
John, it really, really, really was